For the first 6 days in Normandy, the decisive role belonged to the authors of Overlord. Just as the minute a baby is born, the decisive role belongs to the mother. In those 6 days, the doctors on the other shore were powerless to do anything to help the newborn invader. They could only sit and wait for the landing barges to carry him and throw him into the struggle of life. They had no power to speed up or slow down the labor, no power to change the course of the invasion or its route. And for the next month and a half, the invasion was still a weak, immature infant, whose life depended on the juices which the coast daily fed it. But after the first week, the generals, as soon as they left the commanding vessels and arrived on the shore, had some means of sustaining it where their tents were already pitched for them. But still, the success of the first infantile steps of the invasion depended entirely upon the healthy foundations acquired during the period of womb development, when the unborn infant was growing and gaining vitality in the womb of southern England. And, moreover, its destiny, like that of every living thing at the moment of its birth, was determined by the will to life which was inherent in each of the cells which compose it. Were it not for the efforts of individual soldiers, those who landed on the coast and fought for their own lives, the whole invasion operation, so thoroughly thought out and prepared, would have been like a child born fully developed but dead. Here the metaphor ends, for in fact there was not one invasion but 3 in Normandy, and the pressing problem was to combine them in a single effort, more powerful than the simple sum of the 3. The English troops landed on the eastern part of the coast, in an area whose principal points were named Juno and Gold. A few miles west of Juno and Gold landed on the shore another independent landing party, the American. Its landing place at the foot of the steep sandy slopes was named Omaha. All these stretches of coast stretch from east to west parallel to the south coast of England. A little farther west, beyond the Omaha sector, is the town of Isigny, nestled deep in a narrow bay. Here the French coast makes a right-angle bend to the north and juts 30 miles into the channel, forming the Cotentin Peninsula, at the extremity of which is the port of Cherbourg. On the Cotentin Peninsula, we will call it for simplicity Cherbourg Peninsula. A few miles from Isigny is a section which the Americans called Utah. The American assault force which captured Utah was quite an independent force, as was another American force operating on the Omaha section, or the British who landed in the Juno and Gold areas, and 3 assault parties had the same initial mission: to land, force and breach the coastal defences, and advance inland to cover the landing areas from enemy fire. At this stage, each party acted independently, but having accomplished the task, all 3 were to immediately expand their bridgehead in both directions. In this case, Juno and Gold were to join Omaha, and Omaha, having reached Isigny to meet with Utah, after this it could be considered that the Anglo-American pre-bridge fortification was established. The most important task after the creation of the pre-bridge fortification fell to the share of the group that landed on the Cherbourg Peninsula, in the sector Utah. It was to seize the port of Cherbourg. Here it was possible to choose one of 2 ways: either to immediately turn north and go 25 miles directly to Cherbourg, or to continue to advance inland, passing the same 25 miles to reach the Atlantic coast of the peninsula and thus cut it off from the main territory of France. By shutting off reinforcements from the peninsula, it would be possible to break enemy resistance and take the port whenever the American commanders pleased. The capture of the port of Cherbourg appeared in the plan Overlord as one of the main tasks. But the ways of solving this problem, the authors of the plan provided at the discretion of the commander of the field forces. In the question of the development of the success achieved, they had to limit themselves to even less definite instructions. It was firmly established that within 2 months another major port should be occupied, but the commander of the operation had to decide for himself whether it was Le Havre, lying at the mouth of the Seine, 40 miles east of the British landing site, or Brest, which was at least 200 miles away, first to the south, and then at an angle along the Brest Peninsula towards the Atlantic. It was further supposed that after occupying Cherbourg and Le Havre, or breast it, would be natural for the commander to fix his eyes on Paris. But after hinting at this exciting possibility, the imagination of the authors of the plan Overlord suddenly ran out, and, apparently afraid of their own courage, they hastened to demand that the commander for 3 months, at least, stop active operations, using this time to accumulate supplies in the rear, as well as for rest, rearmament and regrouping of troops. In the question of who will command the fighting after the implementation of the landing, the plan Overlord very quickly loses the clarity that characterizes the part that refers to the distribution of responsibilities in the landing operation. The command of all land forces during the landing and immediately after it was vested in General Sir Bernard Montgomery, whose authority was limited by one condition. He had no right to subordinate a unit of one nationality to a commander of another nationality if it was a unit of less than a corps. But it was understood that the time must come when the number of American troops in France would so increase, and the whole area of occupation so enlarged, that this form of command would no longer be satisfactory. From that time on, the commander of the American forces would no longer be subordinate to Montgomery, but both of them, being equalized in rights, will become subordinate to the Allied Supreme Commander. However, the plan did not outline any timetable for such a radical reorganization. It was simply understood that it would take place when, in the opinion of the Supreme Commander, circumstances demanded it. The authors of Overlord were far-sighted enough to see the outline of Paris through the fog of the Norman coast. Apparently, although this is nowhere explicitly stated, they were inclined to believe that until the German armies in France will not be defeated and the French capital will not be taken, the powers of Supreme Commander should remain with the British Commander-in-Chief. So, at any rate, believed the officers of Montgomery's staff. But no matter how things may turn out in the future, and for the time being it was taken for granted that the command of the Allied forces on the continent would pass to Montgomery as soon as all the difficulties of the landing had passed, a stage at which no soul will could influence the course of the operation, and only on the courage and ingenuity of the actual executors depended whether or not to be in Europe a allied army in need of a commander. And when it appeared that there was already such an army in France, or rather 2 armies, British and American, Montgomery began to issue orders, and the campaign began. All military plans depart from an assessment of the enemy's position. Estimates includes accounting and analysis. What forces is the enemy fielding against you? Where exactly is he fielding them? How does he intend to use them? What he is able to do is called his capabilities. In European armies, what you guess he intends to do is called his intentions. The American army does not like guesswork, and therefore the enemy's intentions are not recorded there. However, in the American headquarters, the chances of the enemy using his various capabilities are taken into account. The intelligence section of the headquarters, which in the U.S. Army is called the G2 section, compiles an overall picture of the enemy's alleged actions. It is formed from eyewitness reports of what was seen and heard directly on the front line, from the material of interrogation of prisoners of war, from the data of aerial photography and aerial reconnaissance, from information received from defectors and agents in the enemy rear, from intercepted radio transmissions of the enemy or his telephone conversations, and even from the analysis of official reports and communiques of the enemy. All this data is systematized by the department. The assessment of the enemy's forces is made continuously. From the very beginning, the G2 division knows quite accurately what troops the enemy has at his disposal. It knows the names, numbers, and composition of each unit. During the war, the department follows each unit, studies its special quantities, its regular commanders, notes all its losses, all the reinforcements it receives, takes into account its equipment, ammunition supply, and, most importantly, on the morning of the invasion, the enemy's coastal defences. The famed Atlantic rampart gave him the opportunity to inflict heavy damage on the attackers. The enemy commander could easily pull up enough armed forces from his reserves to gain a numerical advantage. The head echelon of the invasion consisted of 7 divisions, not counting airborne divisions, but it would take at least 2 days to land at least all the elements of the assault divisions. In the contest of speed between Allied landing barges and German railroad echelons, the odds were clearly unequal. During the first 6 days, the Germans could put a dozen fresh divisions into action at any minute against Allied troops with only what ammunition they could bring with them, fighting with no overall command, no control, no communications, no ability to... The enemy's intentions were pretty clear: to throw us all into the sea, if only they could. And yet the forward units of the Anglo-American invasion were neither destroyed nor thrown into the sea, contrary to the jubilant claims of Berlin radio on the morning of the invasion. Only below the cliffs in the Omaha sector was there a brief hiccup. The first assault echelons of the American 1st Infantry Division's huntsmen, engineers, and infantrymen were pinned down by enemy fire for 6 hours, until the destroyer escorts came up and fired direct fire on the bluff's pillboxes, after which the soldiers rushed up the sandy slope under the personal leadership of colonels and brigadier generals. The battle cry reads it. Damn it, we can die up there too. Let's go. And overcoming the cliff, Landing Party Omaha broke through. The enemy's defense line, and on the second day of the invasion, stopped only by order of Montgomery himself. The British at the site of Gold and the Americans at the site of Utah immediately broke through a fairly narrow belt of coastal fortifications, and by noon had advanced several miles deep. Preliminary aerial bombardment and artillery fire from the sea did not cause much damage to the concrete defences, but sowed panic and disorder in the German troops pulled up to the coast. There were no striking units there, and the garrisons consisted mainly of older soldiers who had served too long in the occupation army. In addition, in the ranks of the Germans, a large percentage of mobilized residents of the German-conquered countries of Eastern Europe who did not show much fighting spirit. An even greater role was played by the striking fact that the Allies managed to achieve the effect of complete surprise, both strategic and tactical. The element of strategic surprise was determined by the fact that the Germans had all along expected an invasion from the narrow strait of Pas de Calais, providing the most favourable approaches, and the Normandy coast gave only secondary importance. Moreover, they were convinced that the invasion could not materialize before a month at the earliest. Therefore, they gave all their attention to strengthening the defence of the Pas de Calais. These had settled down, especially since our incessant manoeuvres convinced them that we are not yet ready. As for the tactical side, the Germans were entitled to expect that by one sign or another to learn about the invasion at least 2 days before the first landing. By happy coincidence, the last 2 days before the landing, when our flotilla was already going to the French coast, the sky over the English Channel was covered with a solid layer of clouds. True, the clouds were not so low that the plane could not fly under it, but the German aerial reconnaissance in the Channel area has long been reduced to a formal performance of high-altitude flights, and from an altitude of 30,000 feet on June 4 and 5, the entire Channel was hidden by a continuous cloud shroud. Thus, the Allied armada approached the coast of France undetected. When the Allies struck, the confused defenders of the Atlantic rampart, stunned and taken by surprise, began to roll back in even greater disorder than that which reigned in the landing units in the first days of the landing. But the greatest embarrassment occurred at the headquarters of the German High Command. At last Dieppe sacrifices had paid off, at least in part. Dieppe for a few hours seriously frightened the Germans, who thought that the deployed offensive had begun, and an alarm was given all along the coast. Then, when it turned out that the Dieppe operation was just a local raid of Allied troops, many long burned ears. In June, when the first reports of the approach of the Allied squadron reached the headquarters of Colonel General von Kluge, the commander-in-chief of the Western Front, neither the dispatches at the charts nor after them, the junior officers dared to raise the alarm and wake up their superiors until the reports were confirmed. Nearly 6 hours passed before even one telephone receiver was picked up. The German forces in Normandy were commanded by Field Marshal Rommel, directly subordinate to von Kluge. He was entertaining in Berlin on June 5. Even when the German command finally came to its senses, it could not overcome its first psychological reaction, this feeling of no way. And by the time this feeling passed, the opportunity to strike at individual Allied troops before they joined forces was irretrievably lost. It depends on the quick reaction of its commanders. Without an order from above, nothing cannot be accomplished, no matter how talented, energetic and courageous were junior commanders and their subordinates. Realizing that one horse had been taken from its stall, the Germans rushed to put a lock on the stable gate to save the others. The first action of the enemy command, which had to face Montgomery, was not an order to counterattack the pre-bridge fortification, which everyone expected, and the decision to restrain our forces on this bridgehead, to localize the area of fighting until further intentions of the Allies, to block the pre-bridge fortification. The enemy began to pull up tactical reserves with all possible speed, but instead of undertaking at least local counterattacks, limited to the formation of a continuous front line along which the troops were ordered to entrench. It soon became clear that the Germans did not want to move the forces concentrated in the Pas de Calais area. Who knows whether the landing in Normandy would turn out to be the only or at least the main invasion attempt, to remove troops from the Russian front and take them across Germany. The enemy was also clearly not going to. The nature of the terrain forced the enemy to concentrate most of his tanks around the eastern flank of the pre-bridge fortification, in front of the towns of Caen, as in this area the Allies landed near the plain descending to the Seine River. If Montgomery had succeeded in breaking the front here, forcing the Seine, taking Le Havre and moving further east, the entire German army in France would have been threatened. The Allied advance down the Seine could cut off most of the German divisions. Other parts of the front inspired the Germans with less concern. The Americans had before them not a hospitable plain, but a stretch of hilly terrain stretching for many miles, which the French call the bocage. This terrain is so convenient for defense that even by special assignment no better place could be devised. In utilizing the local conditions of bocage lies the secret of the stratagem that liberated France. It must be clearly imagined that the points chosen for the landing of the paratroopers are located along a narrow coastal strip, to which from the south adjoins a semicircular territory, very peculiar, not like the rest of France. The bocage begins east of Caen and immediately slopes southward, running inland in the form of a flat arc, 60 to 70 miles from the coast. It then turns westward and ends on the coast, at the mouth of the channel near the town of Avranches, at the very bend from which the Brest Peninsula begins. Beyond the bocage, France is a flat country, but bocage in its topography is a cluster of small uplands with no pronounced ridges or peaks. The land on these uplands is riddled with tiny patchwork fields, and each patchwork field is enclosed by a dense hedge running along a ridge. Even if these hedges were not there, however, the very ridges on which they grow provide the field with no less protection than the stone fences of New England. The picture is not the same everywhere. Many fields are also surrounded by ditches 3 or 4 feet deep, and the hedges grow between the ditches of adjacent fields. Some have double hedges, a row of trees and ditches, with an embankment between them. The trees forming the hedges stand in thick and dense rows, and bocage is sometimes also called the edge of the hedges. There are almost no long straight highways, typical for France, in the edge of hedges. The roads are narrow and winding, but countless dwarf fields separated by dense hedges create ideal conditions for defense. The combination of hedges with earth mounds, and sometimes also with ditches filled with water, gives a system of fortifications that look like they were built from a fortification textbook. The hedges prevent one from seeing what is being done in the neighboring field, and each such field can hold a gun big enough to stop a tank. The tanks themselves must scramble through the hedges, over the embankments, revealing their bellies like cardboard targets in a shooting gallery. When retreating along the bocage, the enemy can hold each field for as long as it takes to inflict heavy damage on the attackers, and then disappear from view behind the next hedge, as if specially prepared as an oblique cut-off position for such maneuvers. It was only because, of course, that just beyond the Normandy coastal zone begins the edge of the hedges that the Germans allowed themselves to fortify it so weakly. If the enemy had landed on the coast, further it will not be difficult to hold him until the necessary reinforcements will not approach. At the edges of bocage hills, which make it impregnable, cut off and pass into the lowlands stretching south. To the Loire and east, to the seam battle task for troops landing on the outskirts of bocage is to break through it as soon as possible and go to the specified lowlands. So, as soon as there were enough troops on the coast to have someone to command, before Commander-in-Chief Montgomery outlined the goal, to break out of the ring of defence, which the Germans are increasingly tightly pulled around the Allies, made this goal even more tempting. The realization of a breakthrough in any direction not only provided freedom of maneuver for the Allied tanks on the plain, but also overturned the entire German front. You could count on, what the hell is not kidding, that it will be possible to encircle a significant force of the defenders, because if in the edge of hedges is difficult to advance and retreat is not easier. At the end of the first week, the intelligence department of the headquarters of the 21st Army Group, which was commanded by Montgomery, based on the information received, concluded that the Germans have already used all their tactical reserves. It was then that Montgomery made his bold decision to smash the German army standing against him with the forces of one of his British Second Army, without any help from the Americans. No small part in this decision was played by the successful actions of the Allied air forces, aimed at the so-called blockade of the battlefield. To blockade the battlefield from the air means to fly over the front line and attack the enemy's rear communications. It means destroying his railroad bridges, bombing road junctions, destroying field warehouses, and even storming columns on the march, when soldiers had to already disembark from cars and trucks. A complete blockade in this case is never achieved, but significantly reduced the pace of feeding the front line. In Normandy, such a blockade of the area of pre-bridge fortification was particularly significant because the actions of both sides depended on the speed of the build-up of forces, with Allied reinforcements went through the English Channel and were limited to adhere to a certain and unchanging schedule. And at the disposal of the Germans was an extensive network of excellent railroads and highways in France. The decisive moment for the blockade of the area of pre-bridge fortification was to be the destruction of bridges over the Seine, because then the German echelons coming from eastern France would have to make a big detour through Paris to reach the front. And so overnight a page of military history was turned. Every single bridge across the Seine, from the mouth to the capital of France, was blown up by Allied aircraft. Nothing like this had ever been seen in the world before. Now the flow of German reinforcements turned into a miserable rivulet. Troops were forced to cross on ferries or on temporary pontoon bridges, which had to hide during the day. And railroad echelons were unloaded in Paris, and from there the soldiers on foot or on bicycles advanced to the front, and in the darkness of night the wagons crawled behind them. In order to carry out this operation, the air forces of the Allies had to begin. Of course, with the destruction of frontline airfields of the Germans, so as to drive their aircraft to remote for several hundred miles rear bases. After that, our planes were no longer difficult to numerically suppress and shoot down enemy fighters in air battles over the front line. All these advantages were to use Montgomery. Studying the map of the situation, he seemed to see a repetition of El Alamein. Again in front of him was the enemy, thrown into battle all his available forces and deprived of the ability to systematically bring reinforcements to the theatre. Thus, deprived of resources, the enemy could be bypassed by skillful manoeuvring, defeated and destroyed. Taking all this into account, Sir Bernard decided to give battle for Caen at his own risk. After the capture of Caen, British armoured forces opened the way to the Seine Valley, the first and main point of the plan overlord. The capture of American units Cherbourg and strengthening the port of Cherbourg as a rear base of the developing offensive, Sir Bernard now declared the task of secondary importance. Chief of Staff Montgomery, responding to a related question at a staff meeting, bluntly stated that Bradley and his Americans would, of course, be required to take possession of Cherbourg, but this is only as a matter of discipline. The characterization given to Montgomery Churchill confirmed he was great in defeat and completely unbearable in victory. That very morning, when Chief of Staff Monty Allard expressed his feelings, General Bradley made an independent decision. To go to Cherbourg bypass, that is, first cut off the entire peninsula and then only attack the port itself. At the first attempt to reach the ocean shore, the American division got stuck in the edge of the hedges, advancing no more than a few hundred yards during the day. The division commander was changed and another division was put into action, landing after the assault had passed into the offensive phase. At the other end of the bridgehead, where the junction of the American forces with the British was, along the so-called international boundary line. The American infantry was several miles ahead of the British and complained that its flank remained uncovered. But Montgomery, in constructing his plan to capture Caen, had not considered this circumstance. He felt no need for the assistance of any American units. Perhaps he was guided by other considerations, when, with his quick blue eyes on the map of the situation spread out before him, he reflected on the way it was now, and on the changes that were bound to come in it if he did not act. His headquarters, as his officers told us on the day we arrived at Montgomery's headquarters in March 1944, was the British headquarters. The 21st Army Group, which he commanded, consisted of one British and one Canadian army. When these armies were formed on the south coast of England, their composition was fully manned. From Canada could only expect additions to the divisions already on the battlefield. The English government, for special reasons, dispersed its manpower all the way from the Mediterranean to the Far East. From England itself, too, no newly formed divisions were expected to arrive. But even the expected replenishments were smaller than required, and the British knew in advance that the day would come when they would have to disband some formations to replenish others. Meanwhile, the American forces on the other side of the international boundary line were already outnumbering the forces of the Empire. The signal for invasion was given when the number of American divisions arriving from across the ocean equal to the presence of them in the British Army. But these divisions were followed by more and more formations. Some already landed on the shores of the United Kingdom, others came by sea, others were loaded on ships. Some were being trained, others were still being formed. Today, now, the vanguard of this vast army was under the command of Sir Bernard Montgomery. If the honour of destroying the German army was to belong to England, it had to be hastened, while the Empire's forces on the French coast and across the Channel were at their zenith, and before the Americans eclipsed them, if only by the sheer numbers of their troops. And the map suggested a resplendent victory that could apparently be won with the lightest of losses. So overwhelming was the Allied superiority suddenly. Montgomery and his commanders were a combination singularly unique. They had never known defeat. They had come to war at the end of an almost unbroken series of defeats experienced by their countrymen. They came to war in Africa, at the very gates of Alexandria, in time to prevent the fall of Egypt, and beyond Egypt, the oil regions of the Middle East. 3 favourable circumstances helped them to cope with the crisis. First, the desert separated the enemy from their nearest supply base, and they were forced to make do with what was available at the front. Second, they had new American tanks and trucks at their disposal to replace the scrapped metal that had hitherto made up the fighting equipment of the Mediterranean armies. For the first time in the military history of the Mediterranean, it was possible to operate with an abundance of combat equipment. And finally, Monty's army sniffed at its commander's audacious self-confidence. And soldiers who had been beaten so much, it worked like strong wine. The whole environment in Africa was simply made for Montgomery, his personal properties. Determination, discipline, intolerance for stupid aides and to snooty bosses, and most of all his firm belief in his own strength, his unshakable egocentrism. All this made new people the very officers who so many times could have broken Rommel and did not break because of the stupidity of the top leadership, uncertainty of decisions, lack of equipment and open contradiction between the political and military objectives. And Monty also managed to make his soldiers new men, because they felt his lively spirit, his fighting zeal, and because he gave them new weapons in their hands. These weapons and this spirit helped Montgomery to victory at El Alamein. True, the weapons had been on the way long before Montgomery took command. True, Rommel was quite exhausted by the time of his defeat, for he had fought as long as the British and on almost as lean rations. Not all to this day, Rommel had never yet been defeated, and Montgomery and his Eighth Army had defeated him. After Rommel's defeat at El Alamein, the wind of war in the west blew in the direction of the Allies. Rommel began to roll under the mountain, and at the foot of the mountain, in Tunisia, a large gathering of troops from the Western Hemisphere were waiting to finish him off. All this could not fail to influence Montgomery and his staff. To understand Montgomery's behaviour at Caen, it is necessary to imagine the full circumstances of the loss of Rommel's African corps. Recall the days before the Tunisian victory, when the Americans retreated haphazardly, frightened by a skirmish that turned out to be almost a bluff. The American units under Patton were to use the classic metaphor of one official communique, the walls of the cylinder through which the piston of the Eighth Army would drive the African corps. And Bradley's infantry and tank formations were to march through the hills of the desert to partly interrupt and partly capture 1,500,000 Germans on the edge of the Tunisian peninsula. It was then, recalling the confusion of the first days of the operation, Montgomery dropped a phrase that began the historical distribution. It happened after the end of the campaign. Montgomery gathered at a meeting of his senior commanders and invited each of them to speak to his unit with a report on how the African victory was won. General Patton was also present at this meeting as an observer. After the meeting, a British officer asked Patton how he had enjoyed it. Patton replied that in his opinion there had been too much talking. When this reply was relayed to the British Commander-in-Chief, Montgomery said, and the American headquarters remembered his words well. The next time I see Georgie Patton, I will tell him only 3 things. Get out of my way, take back your soldiers to train them, and leave me your fuel. The hint about training was not accidental. The fact is that after the American defeat at Kasserine Mountain Pass, Field Marshal Alexander's officers quite seriously suggested to the Americans that the campaign plan be changed so that American troops could receive additional training before returning to the front. This is what Terry Allen, then commanding the American 1st Infantry Division, had in mind when addressing his soldiers in front of El Guitar. He said that not only the honor but also the fighting ability of the entire American army depended on how the 1st Division would perform today against the enemy's armored division. El Guitar was the first small American victory since the Kasserine defeat. The American command considered these first failures as an unfortunate but quite natural stage in the process of battle hardening of newly formed formations, a necessary stage on the way to turning newcomers into veterans. But on Montgomery they made an indelible impression, and under this impression he was apparently still in Normandy when he said that Bradley will be required to take Cherbourg in order to maintain discipline. All this was in the mind of the English commander-in-chief as he amassed his forces on the shores of Normandy in front of the little French town of Caen. The same attitude was shared by the officers of his staff. He was their superior, and they themselves were moulded in his image. The moment had come for Vapor on the enemy, who had already used, as at El Alamein, all his available forces. And this blow could be delivered by the British Army, under the direction of the British staff, to the glory and honour of England. There would still be German armies in Europe, which would have to be defeated after Caen fell, but they could be destroyed on the move gradually, one by one, using the American forces already in place after Montgomery had taken over. That, after the initial victory, the command of the American forces would remain with him was beyond doubt. Sir Bernard prepared to strike. The result of Montgomery's decision was the Battle of Caen. That is actually 2 battles, 2 consecutive deployed offensives, continued even after the city itself fell. The operation, which began in mid-June, lasted almost a month and was a failure from which the British Army on the continent never fully recovered. It was the first and last battle in Europe conducted by the forces of the British alone. Montgomery's fears were justified. Never again was he able to gather under his command enough imperial troops to act on his own, and always had to borrow and equipment to create that preponderance of forces without which he dared not even plan an offensive. Montgomery eventually took Caen, but so belatedly that American observers took Stalin's congratulatory telegram to Churchill as a masterpiece of irony. The telegram read succinctly, "Congratulations on the brilliant victory at Caen." Montgomery took Caen only after 2 deployed offensives, of which each required the full use of long-range air power to hit tactical targets. Now beyond Caen, he had to stop after he had ruined the entire British tank corps by throwing his tanks in successive waves under fire from German 88 guns. The German army he opposed not only failed to destroy, but even just to defeat it. After Caen, there was no question of breaking through the bocage. Montgomery's forces were exhausted. British troops fought at Caen, belonged to the best armed forces of the Empire, and the fate of tank formations involved in the battle for Caen was tragically similar to the fate of the British cavalry, immortalized by Tennyson in the attack of the light cavalry. The Germans met Montgomery fire anti-aircraft batteries, which swarmed the entire Channel coast, to anti-aircraft guns direct hit from behind hedges on the advancing tanks. Tacticians from Montgomery's headquarters expected to meet resistance only field artillery. The entry into battle anti-aircraft guns suddenly ruined the case. Calculations on the destructive power of bombers also not quite justified. But most of all, in the failure of the Caen Operation Montgomery was guilty of the hedges bocage. People who learned the military craft on the plains of the African desert, confused, caught in the land of hedges. The personal courage and initiative of the soldiers who survived Africa were saved before the hedges, because these brave and enterprising soldiers had not mastered the terrain on which they had to fight. I say this on the basis of personal observation, because in the preparatory meetings for the Battle of Caen, a group of officers led by a young American colonel named Bonsteel accurately predicted what fate awaited the tanks in the edge of the hedges, but it remained in the minority. As for me, I only listened and wondered. There was a great contradiction between the statements. Some said, "It will be so and so," and others immediately object. No, it will be just the opposite. I followed the argument and heard Bonsteel predict that the tanks would be destroyed. I do not know whether both points of view were reported to the Commander-in-Chief. It was not the task of Montgomery's staff to overturn Sir Bernard's plans. But I do know that even before the order was given to tie the battle for Caen, the reasons for the failure of the outcome of this battle were detailed and outlined in the so-called lower authority. While the British tank forces were failing at Caen, the American infantry began to clear the Cherbourg Peninsula, choosing to do so in the most difficult way possible. Without spectacular aerial bombardment, without massing tanks or even firing shafts of heavy artillery, Bradley believed that crossing the bocage was an infantry affair and that there were no shortcuts to victory. Scrambling from hedge to hedge, climbing up and rolling down, the infantry units that had landed on the Utah side of the river went about cutting off the peninsula. 12 days after landing, they cut off at Barneville-sur-Mer the last German communications linking north and south. This proved not even very difficult, because the Germans still hadn't come to their senses. The whole affair was done by one division, the honoured 9th Infantry, which the other two covered on the flanks. Reaching the west coast, Bradley immediately turned a corps of 3 divisions northward, and within 4 days his troops were fighting their way toward Cherbourg. Another 4 days of fighting, this time with a real artillery and aerial bombardment, and June 26, the first fortified city in Europe fell. The Peninsular Offensive involved merciless urban destruction, perhaps the worst of the entire campaign. The capture of the port itself presented a serious challenge, for it was protected by a semicircle of steep hills, very heavily fortified with concrete and steel. The issue was decided by the speed and swiftness of the offensive. The American onslaught stunned the German garrison. To seize Cherbourg, Bradley used less than half of his forces. But the rest of the divisions he found work. First of all, it was necessary to prevent the Germans from consolidating their position on any part of the front. The order was given. Without suspending the offensive, continue to move inland away from the swamps and flooded areas at the junction of the peninsula with the mainland. The attacks here did not present a spectacular spectacle. They were ordinary everyday fighting, associated with heavy casualties. But day by day the troops moved forward, and by the time Cherbourg fell, they were already a few miles south of the base of the peninsula. Now the Americans had enough room for maneuvering. They had at their disposal a network of excellent roads, and the enemy was pushed far enough away from the coast and from the warehouses and airfields located along it. When Cherbourg fell, Bradley already had 13 divisions in Normandy, and only 6 of them were in the first line after the port was captured. In other words, there were 7 available divisions in reserve. Everything was ready. All that remained was to put the machine in motion. During the entire campaign, to seize the peninsula and expand the bridgehead at its base. Bradley remained nominally subordinate to Montgomery. However, after expressing aloud the opinion that the task undertaken by the Americans was of purely academic interest, the British commander-in-chief left the American commander to his own initiative. Only after the defeat at Caen to the consciousness of Montgomery finally reached the fact that his failure, combined with the success of Bradley, cost him the authority of the commander-in-chief of ground forces in Europe. Perhaps in the calculations of the headquarters of Supreme Commander Eisenhower, and did not include the rapid creation of equal American command. Such a reorganization required operational activity from the headquarters of the Supreme Command, if only to coordinate the actions of both armies. But Montgomery had already played all the British trump cards, while the Americans were ahead of him and moving forward, acting at their own risk at the initiative of Bradley, and now had a large number of troops and sufficient space for the deployment of operations. The SCIF had no choice. Montgomery made another attempt to assert his rights as commander-in-chief. He proposed that the Americans deploy around the immobile flank of the British in the vicinity of Caen and sweep out the entire bocage like a broomstick. He not only suggested this, he gave the order to that effect. But by the time this order reached Bradley's headquarters, in front of Eisenhower already lay on the table, Bradley developed a plan of operation that could decide the outcome of the war. To prefer the ideas of a man who had just been defeated and even unable to continue the fight with his own forces, to the assumptions of the victorious general having at his disposal numerous fresh reserves, would be too ridiculous. Eisenhower took back the unlimited authority he had handed Montgomery for the duration of the landing, and the first act of the drama of command and control on the continent came to an end. As Supreme Commander-in-Chief, preparing to assume his functions, Eisenhower did not vest Bradley with the powers that Montgomery had previously held. For me, he did not even release Bradley from the obligation to obey the operational direction of Montgomery. He simply allowed him to do as he pleased, contrary to the formalities. But for everyone, it was quite clear what actually happened. The command of the Western Front passed from the great Montgomery to the humble Bradley. Eisenhower himself could not actually exercise command on the front, if only by the mere fact that his staff was not at all appropriate to this appointment. The headquarters he was given was not a field headquarters. That was not the kind of task it had before it, and that was not the way it was organized. This headquarters was created to coordinate the military efforts of the British and Americans, not to direct the fighting. It was adapted to take into account the decisions made, not to make them. Strategic decisions were made at the highest levels, by the Council of Chiefs of General Staff of both countries and by the heads of both nations. The tactical decisions of the KF were to be received at the ready from the front commanders. It was conceived as a luxury organization, a multilingual mediator, and it was given all sorts of WC, TAMP, PA, and so much copper that one could open a foundry. This was the KF from the beginning, and it remained so to the end, although in the last phase of the campaign history tried unsuccessfully to impose a more active role on it. Late, when it was over, the shots had rung out. The dead were buried and the prisoners of war were released. The SAF commissioned its press officers to paint a portrait of him, on a metaphorical white horse, sabre in hand, at the head of the Allied armies going into battle. But none of those who have been to the front. It was not able to deceive. While Bradley was taking Cobra and Montgomery was crushing his tanks at Caen, the SCAF in England was hastily putting itself on alert, intending to march into France as soon as any of the armies captured a suitable place for its stay. On the 6th day of the invasion, Eisenhower received the August Council of Chiefs of General Staff at the Pre-Bridge fortification and outlined to them what Montgomery promised to do to the Germans. When it became clear that Montgomery had not done this to the Germans, Eisenhower made Bradley commander-in-chief of the front, on his own merits and also because of the lack of competition, for Montgomery's planners were as tired, apparently, as his troops. By the time Bradley inherited operational command of the front, his own army stood along the St. Louis Road, one of the few thoroughfares cutting through the bocage. This road runs from St. Lo in a westward direction toward the Atlantic coast. For nearly 2 months, acting cautiously, Bradley led his infantry from frontier to frontier. Now it was time to realize a scheme even more ambitious than Montgomery's Caen scheme. The battle for St. Lo required at first a powerful infantry offensive on a relatively narrow front, and this offensive was to continue until the strip of German defences was broken clean through. Having broken through a gap in the outer ring of enemy defences, Bradley intended to let tanks follow the infantry. The plan was bold and risky because the tanks did not break out at once on the plain, which was still 40 miles away. Being already in the German rear, our tanks had to overcome these 40 miles, tearing through the hedges of bocage and only at the base of the Brest Peninsula to reach the flat terrain. The calculation was only for speed, that they could get through faster than the retreating Germans could catch up with them or bring in reserves to cut them off. This part of the plan for the Battle of St. Lo was called Cobra, because the 2 infantry-reinforced tank columns which were to break out into the infantry breach were each almost 100 miles long, and therefore waiting for a decisive throw, they were to curl up in rings behind our front line. When I first heard the name, I thought it was apt, but I immediately thought, I wish there were no mongoose in the German army. It was said that one of the officers of the 1st Army headquarters, imagining that the tank columns would rush forward with lightning speed and wrap themselves around the German army, wanted to name the plan after a snake that strangles its victims, but could not remember any breed of snake except the Cobra. The name proved appropriate, however, because the furious fling in question formed part of Bradley's more extensive plan called Luck. Luck was to be conditioned on a breakthrough that would allow the bocage to be surrounded throughout and France to be liberated. Such was the ambitious plan which Bradley had conceived in England and on the development of which veterans of the African campaign had been labouring at his headquarters ever since. It is difficult now, looking back through the prism of the victory won, to imagine the atmosphere surrounding the creation of Bradley's plan and the beginning of the battle. There were still many untrained novices among his soldiers. The principle of economy of force to which he had hitherto adhered in regard to his armoured divisions, a principle generally sound, had resulted in the fact that these divisions had no experience of fighting on French territory. The historic storm that broke on June 20, 2 weeks after the first landing, turned everything upside down on the coast of the American landing zone. Cherbourg Harbour had just finished being cleared of mines, and it could not yet play any role in supplying Bradley's troops. German radio propaganda was already shouting at every voice that the Allies at the Normandy bridgehead had reached a stalemate. Bradley had no reason to believe that Bocage's difficulties could be overcome without unacceptable losses. The tank blitz he had conceived in the conditions of the terrain seemed insane, especially after Yet Bradley prepared to use all his available forces for the most complex maneuver, requiring maximum coordination and impeccably organized supply, and with it to deliver a decisive blow. The statistics of casualties per 1 mile of the bocage offensive route spoke against Bradley's plan. It violated one of the basic tactical laws requiring an attacking column to cut 50 miles into the enemy's position without any support from the flanks. Bradley, however, argued that although it had never been done before, it could be done this time, for aviation would be used to protect the flanks. Aerial reconnaissance would pinpoint the enemy's location, and fighter bombers would disperse any large body of troops against the tank raid. Supply techniques also spoke against the plan, because after the tank columns on the plain, ammunition, fuel and food would have to come to them through a narrow corridor formed by the only road leading from Normandy to the Brest Peninsula along the Atlantic coast of the English Channel, and that road would be clogged with the transport of the advancing army itself. But Bradley said, "Well, we'll have to get the advancing army through and clear the road as soon as possible." Just before the Battle of Saint-Lô began, we, a group of officers who had been under Montgomery since March, returned to Bradley's headquarters. Our tenure under Montgomery's headquarters as observers had expired. In due course, we had been sent to the British Army so that by the time an independent American command was organized, we could inform American headquarters of Montgomery's plans and intentions. In fact, Bradley had begun operating independently somewhat earlier than our return. Bradley had the use of the headquarters of the First Army, and the officers of that headquarters could never forget that he had at one time been in charge at the front. The headquarters of the 12th Army Group, which later became Bradley's main headquarters, they tended to look upon as usurpers. For the first time after our return, we only familiarized ourselves with the plans already drawn up for Bradley by officers of the First Army headquarters. These plans provided for the transfer of a portion of the troops of the First Army, already in the course of the fighting, to the headquarters of the Third Army, which at that time was still in England and preparing to march under Patton's command. Third Army was to be put into action immediately after the breakthrough and to ensure the development of success when the tanks will go to the plain. Command of the First Army would pass to Courtney Hodges, who had been hanging around Omar Bradley since the beginning of the invasion preparations. Omar himself was finally assuming command of the headquarters of the American Army Group, which had been headed for so long by staff chiefs. Thus, the scheme of command of the American army that liberated France was determined as follows. The principal direction was exercised by Omar through the headquarters of the 12th Army Group, to which the 1st Army under Hodges and the 3rd under Patton were directly subordinate. All this had been worked out before Saint-Lô and thought out by Bradley himself before leaving Bristol. Thought out in every detail except the Dayton situation, which he could not have foreseen before the pre-bridge fortification was established. The enemy adopted the tactic of stiffening our forces, and Montgomery failed in his attempt to break the barrier at Caen. For the last week before the battle for Saint-Lô began, the situation on the continent was quite cosy. The Allied pre-bridge fortifications everywhere, but the Cherbourg Peninsula extended only 15 to 20 miles in depth. All the headquarters, one below the other, were squeezed between batteries of 150 and 155 mun guns, which were incessantly unloaded, set in position, and it cost nothing to drive a jeep around the entire theatre of war on the continent in one morning, because the roads, at least in the American sector, were surprisingly free. The traffic went one way, from the landing zone to the field depots that stretched for miles among the orchards. The first major fighter airfield, close to the road to the Isigny area, had been under German artillery fire for some time, and heavy P-51s would take off from the far end of the airfield, drop underwing bombs before they were out of sight, turn abruptly and land for a new bomb load. For the communication planes at the headquarters of each major compound had its own landing area. A section of the field, freed from the bulwarks which dug the Germans to prevent the gliders from landing. From the window of a small L-5 communications plane travelling along the shore, could see the entire invasion fleet. Dozens of hundreds of ships stood in the roadstead, waiting for unloading, and around them scurried back and forth small dukes and landing barges, behind which foamed white stripes of Kielwartene jets. flying almost at the level of the barrage balloons raised above each ship. It was possible to see on the horizon a string of transports moving solemnly away from the English shore. And through another window facing the coastal hills could be seen in the distance the front line, marked by the white and black smoke of bursts. Shells were tearing incessantly along the entire front, even in the quietest sections. We had more than enough artillery and ammunition, and the task was only to find suitable targets for shelling. The shells sliced off the tops of trees and dug craters in the soft earth. Most of our roads were shot all along, but the Germans opened fire only when they were sure they would hit the target. The narrowest section of the pre-bridge fortification began beyond Carenton, and there were signs on the road warning that the bridges were under fire, so that we had to rush across them at 40 or 50 miles an hour. But we did not have many casualties in the rear areas. The real fun began at night. Every evening, just as the last streak of sunset was fading, enemy planes appeared in the sky, as if it were a lighting effect in a theatrical production. The silent rumble of cannonade was joined by the distant slamming of anti-aircraft guns, and in a second everything around turned into an inferno. All the guns of the coast, 37mm large-caliber machine guns, bars, M1s, were hitting. Tracer bullets were streaking the sky in fantastic patterns, diverging in all directions, because no one knew exactly where to look for any planes. The decks of hundreds of ships, illuminated by the flashes of thousands of gun salvos, under a sky covered with a multicolored glittering web. Everything seemed to be in motion. And then there was a long, shrill whistle, and then a sound as if a fat giant had fallen into a vat of jelly. The ground shook, and a muffled, short whoosh broke into the excited crackle of the machine guns. Sometimes after that a column of flame would rise to the sky. This meant that the gasoline depot had caught fire. Sometimes the whistling would build up into such a devilish crescendo that you would throw yourself to the ground in terror. These were rocket shells. The sound they made as they flew by cannot be described in any words. Once a night fighter jet shot down a German airplane right over my head. It was scary to watch it. Both planes went over the very trees, and I first saw the tracer bullets of the night fighter. You could distinguish them by their trajectory, and besides they flew so close that you could hear their angry buzzing. The noise of the planes raised desperate. There was the crackle of engines, and the whistle of cutting air and cannon firing from the fighter. The enemy plane burst into flames all of a sudden, at once. One would have thought that it exploded. But it did not explode, and in a split second it fell, flaming half a mile from where I was standing. Yes, it was scary at night at the Normandy bridgehead. When the battle plan for Saint-Lô was fully developed, it became clear to each of us. Either it would be scary at night for a long time there, or the bridge fortification would cease to exist at all, because the American army was preparing to play for keeps. The offensive was to begin on Saturday, the 24th. I and another officer, named John Watson, took up the study of the terrain on the map and outlined a small height a few kilometers northwest of Saint-Lô. We calculated that from there we would be able to see the initial line of attack. We took 2 jeeps and left there early Saturday morning. The infantry attack was to begin, if I am not mistaken, at 3 o'clock. We knew that it would be preceded by a large air attack from the air. Curiously enough, we travelled along the entire front of the American troops and drove beyond the line of outposts, after which the German positions began around 2 bends in the road. And not only did no one stop us once, but we did not even meet a single person. A week before, 4 German colonels had come from Paris, to look around, so to speak, and they had passed through all the German and American positions just as smoothly. They stopped already in our rear, having thus travelled from the Paris boulevards to the Normandy prisoner-of-war camps in 5 hours or so, without the slightest trouble. The only circumstance that prevented us from making the same walk in the opposite direction was that in one village we encountered a burning Markiv tank, and this required some discussion. In the village, in the middle of which the tank was burning, there were not only no inhabitants left, but not even houses. Only the dilapidated facade of a church and a stone well remained. while we consulted standing at the well. Another jeep, in which sat 2 American soldiers, and was going to immediately turn to the roadway, departing to the right. But we delayed him. We learned from the soldiers that the section of the front occupied by the 30th Infantry Division was at this very spot, but that the division had moved back 2 miles this morning to clear the area for aerial bombardment. When, guided by the compass and the information we had received, we got out to the height we had planned earlier, we saw a rifle company on its back slope, whose men were checking their grenades and ammunition and were already in battle order. The top of our hill was crossed by a road laid in a notch. At one end of it was blocked by a burned German tank. In the roadside ditches on both sides there were dirty, soaked junk, abandoned by the Germans. Here we spent the whole day, waiting for the battle to break out. It did not come to the heat of the day. After the artillery preparation, the aviation began its actions, but where we came from, someone did not like something, and the infantry attack was postponed for 24 hours. It took place the day after tomorrow, after a secondary preparation. From the impressions of the battle for Saint-Lô, I especially remember the general picture of the battlefield and also the aerial bombardment, which was a 3-act. First appeared on the scene heavy bombers, then medium and finally fighter bombers. The overall picture strongly resembled illustrations from the history of the War of North and South. Our troops were indicating their location to our aircraft with smoke bombs. The smoke was of a dirty purple hue. Even at our place, at a distance of a mile, it was not visible. And we realized that it was of no use to the planes, but it drifted over the valleys and woods just as, judging from the pictures, the smoke drifted over the battlefields of the Civil War. When we could see some moving human figures through binoculars, it was impossible to determine whether they were Germans or Germans. Men with rifles, that's all. We saw German batteries firing from behind the hills and heard ours answering them from behind. It was what is called an artillery duel. Both were firing directly at the enemy batteries, ignoring intermediate targets. The shells were flying directly over our high rise, and here for the first time I had to face one optical phenomenon. It turns out that in field binoculars you can observe the flight of a shell. I pointed the binoculars at the almost cloudless sky to see if I could see any flying fortresses on the horizon, and suddenly I noticed some black dots crossing the field of view of the binoculars. What the devil? Why are there so many birds here? There's no, I thought, but looking closely at the shape of the dots, I realized that they were not birds, and that I was seeing shells flying. Ours in one direction, the German ones on the way in the other. We were in range of German mortar fire. At first we stood on a burned tank, together with one military cameraman who immediately appreciated the advantages of the position we had chosen. But after a while we got off the tank and lay down in a roadside ditch, deciding to observe from there what was being done behind the hedges. This came in very handy, because the 3rd or 4th wave of flying fortresses had wiped out 6 or 7 fields of bocage from French soil, at a distance of an average city block from our observation point. This, too, was a terrible sight. When the first fortresses struck, we were definitely covered with a glittering canopy. So shiny were their wings in the sun. Dropped their heavy bombs turned the enemy defense lines into a chaos of fire, smoke and dust. The fortresses flew too high, and we could not get advance warning that one series of bombs will lie so short of flight. That series of which I speak rushed straight at us like 100 frenzied courier trains in the night delirium of a sick man. My driver claimed that he was thrown into the air with the trench in which he was lying, and at a height of 50 yards was shaken out so that he fell back to the ground on his own. I can't vouch for the veracity of that. I personally had the sensation of what it must be like when a motorboat going 60 miles an hour hits a coastal cliff. My eyes came just at the level of the embankment, and I looked through the gap between the top edge of the embankment and the visor of my helmet, hoping to see a bomb hit behind the German leading edge. Instead, I saw the entire hillside right in front of me shoot up in a continuous wall of orange flame and seem to scatter in a rain of debris and dirt only a few minutes later. The ground shook so violently that I involuntarily clutched at it. None of us were hurt in the bombing salvo of the fortresses. It was simply an exhilarating ride, like the Coney Island Ferris wheel, roller coasters, and other sources of thrills. But he certainly didn't let us get bored. The highlight of the afternoon was the appearance of 3 fighter bombers that had also deviated from the route. They deviated by no more and no less than 90 degrees, and instead of flying parallel to our front and bombing the area along the St. Los Road, they apparently mistook the south-north highway for the east-west highway and flew perpendicular to the American front. This was no fun at all, because to fighter bombers both a single car and a single pedestrian are targets. This trio spotted a small American field depot on the other side of the road and an American battery nearby and shelled both. While all this was going on, John Watson and I, standing in the middle of the road, were having a heated argument about what kind of planes they were, ours or German. I was looking at them through binoculars and could see parallel white stripes on the underside of the wings, and even a star on one of them, so I knew for sure that they were ours, and that it was foolish to go for cover. They had just caught us in passing on their way back to base. John did not look through the binoculars, but said that the clipped ends of the wings, and in addition, the determination with which all 3 planes were dive-bombing us, make him say that they were Focke Wulfs. There were still several hundred fighter bombers on a combat course, and for an hour we watched their raids. They first came in links of no 3, then rearranged no 1 and dived not steeply, but smoothly, gently, steeply descending, approaching the ground. Finally 2 small bombs were separated from the airplane. They seemed to fly under the airplane and parallel to it for quite a long time. Then they gradually deviated and finally fell, exploding small fountains of earth. After the fighter bombers flew by, we were essentially allowed to go home. But by this time the German artillery had stopped probing the American batteries and concentrated their fire on a crossroads a quarter of a mile behind us. We could hear shells squealing and laying down. The shelling stopped only as dusk fell. We settled into our jeeps and drove home to an orchard a few miles offshore. There, in comfortable individual trenches, we could rest easy until the evening concert began. It is said that an individual trench, especially if there is 6 inches of cold water at the bottom of it, is the most uncomfortable place in the world to sleep. That may be true, but on a warm summer night, when there are splinters of steel in the air, and there are enough blankets in the trench and a tent to cover it from the dew, there is no better place to sleep. And if it is 3 feet deep, the only thing you regret is that it is not 6, and you give yourself your word tomorrow to deepen it to 6 feet. But in the morning the sun shines again, and you hear only the cannonade of your batteries, and the lulling rumble of shells moving away from you towards the enemy, and you decide, what the devil? After, if I dig a deeper foxhole, it will be harder for me to get out of it in the morning. So that day we saw a demonstration strike on St. Lo, and the day after that it began in earnest. The success of the breakthrough plan hatched by Bradley exceeded all our wildest expectations. It was undoubtedly the greatest battle in which American troops had hitherto been engaged. Of all Allied land operations during this war, only the encirclement of the Rouher, conducted later, also under Bradley's leadership, can be compared to it in effectiveness. The Battle of St. Lo liberated France. The encirclement of the Rouher completed the demise of the Third Empire. The honour of both of these victories belongs entirely to Bradley, and both were won with American arms, without any Allied help. It seems to me that the American people have a right to know that it was they who gave to the world a commander and soldiers who won battles that were not inferior to the most brilliant victories of Napoleon and other European generals. Now, as it seems to me, when atomic bombs and rockets have fundamentally changed the whole character of the war, anyone writing about the war cannot escape the feeling that all his experience and observations are hopelessly outdated, and that to analyze the tactics and strategy of these years, like studying the behavior of archers at Crécy. It may be of interest to historians, but it is a world past. Bradley's European campaign will probably remain the last great campaign conducted with such prehistoric equipment, as armoured vehicles on wheels and tracks, internal combustion engines, guns loaded from the breech, with cumbersome anti-collapse devices, planes that fly at only a few hundred miles per hour and throw only tiny 10-ton bombs, barely capable of destroying a substantial suspension bridge at one time. True, by the end of this war we had recoilless cannon that could be held with one hand, shells that emitted their own radio waves and exploded only when they found the right target, airplanes without propellers and pilots whose speed was faster than the speed of sound. But even all of this is now obsolete. Everyone recognizes that we now live in a new world, the world of physics. But there was a moment when the fate of this newly born new world depended on the victory of Bradley and his old-fashioned army. A week after the first soldiers of the Allied armies entered French soil, the Germans fired their first long-range automatic projectiles, first airplanes, shells, and then stratospheric rockets. We now know that with these inventions, and others whose secret is still unknown, German scientists hoped to win the war. We know even more than that. We know that Hitler's entire calculation was that in this last year of the war he would have time to overwhelm us with the novelty of his technology before we crush him with the quantitative superiority of ours. We know that until the very end, until the moment when the Russians have already stormed into Berlin, Hitler, having lost Silesia, the Ruhr, the Saarland, continued to cherish the plan of ultimate victory, and maybe if he had another year of term, he would have realized it. Some of this plan Hitler partially managed to realize. He equipped his submarine fleet with devices that nullify all the technique of anti-submarine warfare, which the Allies have developed over the years, putting on it a lot of patience, courage, and knowledge. German submarines had already learned to breathe underwater and to fool many of our locating devices. When the war ended, the Germans already had jet airplanes in mass production, with speeds 100 miles per hour greater than our fastest fighter planes, although the technique for effectively utilizing these tremendous speeds had not yet been developed. When we took over the experimental rocket stations, research work on them was still in full swing. Now, when wandering among the ruins of Frankfurt or Berlin, it is hard to imagine that this was a real threat, and yet it was. At the time of the Battle of St. Lo, the threat was very real. If Bradley had lost that battle, if he had suffered a serious defeat, the magnitude of the catastrophe would have been hard to imagine. An entire German army was still in reserve on the Pass de Calais Peninsula, no matter how well we disguised the fact that the Germans in Calais had, in fact, nothing to fear. We really would not have enough men or landing craft for a second invasion. If the success of the German defences to the Caen area in August had been followed by the defeat of the American army, even dispatchers from the German General Staff would have known that it was possible to bear the entire north coast of France without risk for a massive attack on the Normandy bridgehead. The neatness of our attack would have been thwarted. We could have transferred to Normandy as many troops from North Africa, but these would have been deprived of manoeuvring space, and in winter, when the landing zone lost its importance, the presence of these troops would have created an additional difficulty. One Cherbourg port did not completely solve the problem of supplying even those armies that in the summer were already on the continent. The traits of a great commander is that he is able to take into account all these factors and, based on the limited data at his disposal, foresee further developments. Bradley showed himself a great commander, able to correctly assess two circumstances. First, that with our superiority in the air, the American armies, relatively inexperienced, can still venture to the general decisive battle and win it, and secondly, that this battle should be given immediately, without any delay, without waiting for further build-up of forces. Cobra was activated on June 25, and after the first demonstrative attack, the whole force was put into action. All morning the sky again sparkled with the silver wings of airplanes. First past the fortresses, then medium bombers and finally fighter bombers, which smoothly dive and over the very ground through their bombs like tiny arrows. In the afternoon the infantry came up. The three divisions marched forward in unison across fields, riddled with craters at every step. when the infantry was already advancing among the hills, came into motion long columns of tanks. Roads for miles around were clogged with tanks, which circled, looped, then turned to a side road, then back on the highway, and the military police made sure that the threads of this gigantic unravelling tangle did not get tangled. All through the first night and the next day and night, the battle for Saint-Lô was an infantry battle. By the beginning of the third day, infantry wedged 5 miles into the echeloned enemy defences, and the tanks that followed rushed into the depths of the breakthrough. The head of the first tank column reached the main highway leading south. On this highway retreating German troops. American fighters in formation of 2 by 3 by 4 came in over them, scattered and dive-bombed. 4 days later, the remains of destroyed German equipment were still smouldering on the road. The forward units of the 1st American tank column crashed into the rearguard of the Germans' left flank group. Liaison planes flew back and forth, flying back and forth over the column, following its route. The fervour of the chase passed to them, and they dive-bombed along with the fighters. The pilots fired their machine gun pistols, peering out the open cockpit windows. One such pilot captured an entire group of prisoners by taking them in the crosshairs of his 4.5-line revolver. The final Battle of Saint-Lô was fought on what is commonly referred to as the heights east of Avranches. Avranches is a town located at the very corner of the escarpment that forms the Brest Peninsula on the Atlantic coast. Avranches stands on a hill. South of it begins a lowland stretching to the west, to Brest, to the south-east, to Saint-Nazaire to the east, along the southern border of the bocage, to Chartres and Paris. A mountain range approaches Avranches itself from the east. This ridge represents a key position controlling the exit from Normandy into central France. Through Avranches, American tanks passed Avranches exactly 5 days after the offensive. On the morning, the American infantry, following in trucks, reached the heights east of Avranches, and the song of the Germans was sung. Then began the first Hitler battle, the first of a number of battles which, as we now know, were given on Hitler's personal orders. The British tried to save the tarnished reputation of Montgomery at Caen, portraying the actions of the British Second Army as a manoeuvre calculated to divert the German army away from us by sacrificing themselves. To see the incorrectness of this assertion, it is enough to take a map of the intelligence department and calculate the German forces on both parts of the front. The troops operating against the Americans even slightly outnumbered the army, which the Germans concentrated on the Canskoy flank. However, the German command had to keep most of the tank forces in reserve of the Caen grouping to prevent the Allies from breaking through into the Seine Valley. Once the Americans broke through the front at Saint-Lô, the Germans, of course, should have used this reserve to cover the retreat of their army from the pre-bridge fortification back behind the Seine. They would have had the strength to do so. The army was not defeated. The morale of the soldiers remained pretty good, and while we were advancing behind Avranches and deciding what to do next, they had plenty of time to pull back, turning around Caen. The alphabetical rules suggested just such a manoeuvre, and had it been applied properly, the Germans would have had an army to counterattack already after the breakthrough when our front was most stretched. Instead, Hitler gathered from the entire front mobile forces, removed all the tanks from the area of Caen and all this thrown to the west, with the purpose of preventing the American breakthrough in the direction of Morton. Normandy, a town among the hills of Bocage, near the Atlantic coast, a little east of Avranches. Here Hitler gnawed into the carotid artery, through which pulsed the lifeblood of the newborn Third Army. He bit into it with the teeth of 4 panzer divisions, straining all his forces, including air. The American corridor in the Mortain area consisted of that single coastal road leading to Avranches and an adjacent stretch of hilly terrain several miles wide. We could see the beginning of the German advance, because the weather was clear and the German tank columns were advancing, skirting the boundaries of the pre-bridge fortification to the south and west. Bradley moved the 30th Division forward and assigned 2 more divisions to the immediate reserve. The main thing now was to ensure the Third Army's continued advance through the gap in the German defences. Patton was already calling for reinforcements to widen the breakthrough to the south. The coastal highway was an imposing sight. For 60 miles the vehicles were running side by side. The whole avalanche rolled southward day and night. By day it went under a network of covering fighters. At night its path was illuminated by parachute flares dropped from German planes and fireworks of anti-aircraft fire. At Mortain, the German tanks entered the battle right from the get-go, not even stopping to regroup. They had only a few miles to go, so the road to Avranches was under their fire, and a few more to cut it altogether. But under Mortain, Hitler had to learn the very truth that had already realized before him Montgomery. That, in the edge of the hedges, cannot fight tanks against infantry. In addition, in this battle, the Nazis for the first time tested the fighting qualities of American artillery in defense. The guns showed such a rate of fire that, according to some prisoners, the Germans thought they were dealing with automatic fire. The American artillery specialized in the so-called serenade. This is a system of artillery fire control in which guns of different calibers and different distances from the target fire according to an elaborate schedule, thanks to which all shells hit the target at the same time. The schedule is designed so that close batteries hit when the shells of long-range guns are already flying. The infantry of the 30th Division, in conjunction with the serenade of the batteries behind it, stopped 4 divisions of formidable German tanks at Mortain, not even ceding a piece of territory that could fit a decent evening newspaper headline. The battle lasted 3 days without a break. Then it was over. It was possible to summarize the results. The American army had made a multi-mile crossing, taking advantage of the only narrow road along the coast, occupied the hilltop town of Avranches and its environs, and reached the base of the Brest Peninsula. To make intelligible the freedom of action which opened before Bradley. After the Third Army had penetrated the German rear, it is necessary for a moment to turn away from the chronicle of the exploits of Anglo-American arms and to do justice to the movement of internal resistance in France. The underground army is always surrounded by a romantic halo, and its exaggerated eulogies naturally figure prominently in military propaganda, and therefore every one of us who first had to encounter the guerrilla forces in France, and later in Belgium, was struck by their great achievements under difficult conditions. In the field headquarters one has to wring factual substance from romantic legends. Stories about the personal heroism of French partisans, about unequal battles with the enemy in the name of an idea, we listened with respect but without much interest, believing that this is material for fiction, for history, which will glorify the fallen martyr. But we had to change our attitude when we became convinced that at least 6 living and real German divisions were engaged in fighting the resistance. So serious was the resistance 6 divisions which under other circumstances would have stood against us at Bocage. And even hardened skeptics had to wonder when captured German officers told us that in central France the Germans were living under perpetual fear, that they dared not go out unarmed, were constrained in their movements, and in fact had lost control of some quite considerable areas even before we arrived. Caught in a vise between us and the resistance, the German High Command was eventually forced to resort to divisions doing police duty in central France to reinforce its Normandy army. But as soon as the Germans eased the police pressure, Maquis' activity began to increase exponentially. In the lowlands south of Bocage and beyond, the Germans had no troops left to block the road and slow our advance. The French partisans had partly defeated, partly paralyzed them. The advancing army a question of vital importance. Whether it can pass through the occupied city, shelling only the neighborhoods adjacent to the road, or must delay to catch the loners who send bullets at you from any window and who, if left at large, will then derail your trains with ammunition. All the way from St. Lo to the German border, we did not have to worry about a single town that remained in our rear. It was worth 1 American car appeared on the streets of the city. And in a few hours it turned out that the local population killed or disarmed the entire German garrison. The Maquis had set traps in advance, and their steel jaws closed quickly, and for each scout sent forward meant not one pair of eyes, but 20. There are Germans in that forest, about 1,000 of them, but they have no vehicles. Over that hill, just beyond the turn of the road, an anti-tank trap, and this road you can go safely. Uncle Henry walked on it in the morning, and the Germans left there at night. It's hard to even consider how important it is for the morale of an advancing army to know that there are friends around. For each individual soldier, it means that if he is separated from his own, he will be led to the right road. If he is surrounded, he will be hidden until help arrives. And this is not the false friendliness of the vanquished instilled by force. It is the sincere friendship of men who hate our enemy even more than you hate him. A history that would attempt to attribute the honour of the Allied victories in France and Belgium to the artillery and aviation of the Allied armies alone would be incomplete. It has been established that the French resistance replaced an extra 24 divisions for us, maybe more. First, when the German garrison of Paris was defeated before the first Allied soldier appeared. Second, when we crossed the German border and felt in all acuteness what it means to go forward, when in the rear of you are not friends, but enemies. All this will explain in part why in France was so important to break through the defences of the German field armies. While the enemy army is firmly seated in the towns and villages, the partisans can only whisper about their plans. But when the liberating army approaches, they are able to sow death, fear and confusion in the ranks of the retreating enemy. And coming into the expanse beyond Avranches, the American armies plunged like red-hot knives into the enemy's rear. Already disorganized by the resistance of the French guerrillas,